Dr. Buddharashmi Mani, I welcome all the distinguished audience to our third public lecture of 2025. This public lecture is part of our regular program offered at the National Museum. Through our lecture series, we invite renowned academicians, archaeologists, subject experts, and independent researchers to share their research work and their recent discoveries with us. You will remember that in our previous lecture, we discussed about the fascinating world of marine archaeology. It was delivered by Dr. Rajiv Nigam. Now today's lecture, entitled Evolution of Linga Worship in Early Indian Iconography, will be delivered by Dr. Seema Bawa. Madam is a distinguished professor specializing in history of South Asian art and culture at the Department of History, University of Delhi. Her scholarly contributions include seminal works such as Gods, Men and Women, Gender and Sexuality in Early Indian Art and Religion, and Art of Chamba Valley, AD 700 to 1300. She has also edited important volumes like Delights and Desquits of Leisure in Pre-Modern India, Locating Pleasure in Indian History, Prescribed and Proscribed Desires. Her research spans a broad range of fields, including ancient Indian art and iconography, Western Himalayan art and religion, and modern and contemporary Indian art. She has been awarded the prestigious Dark Fellowship, enabling her to pursue research at University of Bonn. Among the key themes of her research are the narrative depictions of the Ramayana, visual hagiographies of figures such as Gandhi, and the study of Gupta and post-Gupta Shaivism in northern India. Professor Bawa has delivered numerous lectures both in India and internationally, sharing her expertise on Indian art, architecture, and culture. Her scholarly articles on early Indian sculpture and architecture have been published in a range of peer-reviewed journals. Additionally, she has also written extensively on contemporary Indian art and culture for national newspapers, specialized journals, and magazines. As an art curator, she has contributed significantly to Indian art scene, having edited Art Times and curated major exhibitions such as The Decorated Cow, Siddhartha and Shatadaru, Feminine Sensibilities in Indian Art for the Lalit Kala Academy. Furthermore, her academic knowledge extends into curation of art exhibitions, art writing for both popular and specialized publications, theatre design, and compilation of contemporary art history, making her a key figure in the intersection of scholarship, curation, and artistic expression. Ma'am, it is both our honor and pleasure to have you with us at the National Museum today and for your lecture. Now, I would invite our Director General, Dr. Buddharashmi Mani, to kindly address the audience, followed by a presentation of Siddhartha Buddha replica to our speaker. So please.
Respected Professor Seema Bawa, dear participants, scholars from National Museum, Indian Institute of Heritage, and from other institutions. It is a delightful moment for all of us to hear Professor Bawa, who is going to speak on evolution of linga worship in early Indian iconography. Some people trace this form of worship from Saraswati Sindhu civilization onwards. But I hope in this lecture we all would be going to listen about the form of linga worship which is popular in India, throughout India, uh, from the early historic period onwards. And the centers, they were Kaushambi, Mathura, and other places. So, Professor Bawa is known to me particularly for last at least 20 years or so, if not more than that. And I always appreciate her scholarship and the work which she had carried out on art history. So, without wasting my time and your time in speaking in between you and the speaker, I would welcome Professor Bawa for this illuminating lecture which we have organized as public lecture, the third public lecture for this year 2025. Thank you very much.
Ma'am, may we please invite you on the stage, and I will request my lovely audience to give her a big round of applause as she walks up the stage.
Thank you so much. Just find my presentation. Thank you for having me, and I'd like to thank Dr. Mani, who, as he said, we've known each other for a very long time, and he's one of the most respected archaeologists and art administrators that we have. I'm sorry that you will have to suffer through a very sore throat, but I didn't want to miss the opportunity because this is my alma mater in a way, because I did my PhD from the institute, which is now called Institute of Heritage Studies. So it's a rare honor for me to be here, and I'm very happy to see you all. The talk today is limited because much work has been done on the evolution of the linga per se. Kreisel, Mitterwallner, Doris Smith, Srinivasan, N.P. Joshi, V.S. Agarwala, and I'm just naming very, very few of the scholars who've worked on the linga worship. I may have some quibbles with their dating or with their identification, but nevertheless, broad framework had been set by these scholars, and the main focus of their work was basically on typologically identifying and classifying the early lingas, and basically there is a broad classification, which is one, whether there is a face or not on the shaft of the linga, two, the ratio between the shaft and the face, and If only a shaft, then whether it is naturalistic or abstracted, the linga or the phallic shape is abstracted or not. And lastly, the number of ekamukha lingas or number of faces, whether it's a ekamukha linga, chaturmukha linga, or panchamukha linga. So the placement and the shape of the third eye is also a major identifying mark. Now, this has been used to chronologically arrange lingas in North India and to an extent Karnataka. We'll be looking at one example of this. The other corpus, whether it's Alexis Sanderson or Peter Bishop, is basically looking at the theological roots of Shivaism. I have depended on both these scholarships, but this is not the focus of my presentation per se. I am looking at Kushar and Gupta, little pre-Kushar, Kushar and Gupta Shiva Lingas, and how their worship is related, developed, and how this is iconographically represented in the specimens under discussion. I will maybe, if time permits, be talking about some epigraphic inscription and inscriptional evidence that we may have. So to begin with, I would like to posit two things. One is that the linga worship in the early historic period referred to by Dr. Mani is to be read within the larger religious landscape of this period, where stupas, lingas, stambhas, vrikshas were worshipped through touch, through circumambulation, through offerings. And this is very clear from Brahmana literature, where you have a reference to the collation of these as categories of objects of worship. These were, it seems, independent and autonomous objects of worship that were set in their own railings and which made up a shrine, which were called chaitya. So you have a vriksha chaitya, a yaksha chaitya, a stamba chaitya, which themselves were worshipped. John Irwin has talked about the roots of these, of the pillars as objects of worship, where these were worshipped as yupa, that is sacrificial posts, or sthanu, which is the pillar per se, which unites the three realms. Given that there is a pre-existent or a contemporary stream of religion and religious thought and practice that exists, which we can see, and I've taken these two from Vidisha. Everybody, most of us are students of history of art, would know that these are the Vidisha Yaksha and Yakshi. I have tried to see how they were found in fields, probably at crossroads, in their own shrines. They are on a pedestal, right? And they probably had a shrine around them, which consisted of a Vedika, which we know from architectural evidence. Similarly, we had pillars. Now these pillars were, it's been speculated and almost accepted by everybody that some of the Ashokan pillars are pre-existent, and Ashoka embellished these. Some he made, but some were embellished. Pre-existent pillars, because pillars were already objects of worship with railings around them. Now, given that we have this kind of background, let's come very quickly to this very famous example of a very early Shivalinga, or the Parshurameshwar Gutimallam Shivalinga, which can be dated to 2nd century BCE from Andhra Pradesh. Now, why I haven't taken an archaeological picture and taken one that when I went, how it is being worshipped today, is to give you an idea about the rituals, etc. But one element that is absolutely original is the railing shrine that you see. We know that the temple itself was built by the Pallavas and expanded in the post-Pallava period. Before that, this may have been an open space where you have this linga enshrined in its own railing-like structure. It's not really a railing, it's just a simulation of a railing. So it gives you an idea of how it encloses the space, creating a sacredness around it. The other important thing is its relationship to previous and pre-existent layer of worship of the yakshas, because here underneath this is this figure holding a parshu and a battle axe, or a battle axe in his hand, and a ram who is standing on a yaksha. Okay, so obviously the newly emerging theistic religions were incorporating and appropriating there is a worship coming from, for example, the Yaksha or the Naga worship, both of which get adapted to both Vishnuism and Shivaism. Guti Mallam is a very good example of how literal or visual translation of this takes place. Because obviously I can't live on one particular sculpture, I will now move on to another very important piece from Arghapur now in Mathura, in Bharatpur Museum, obviously from the Mathura atelier. This is, as you can see from the styles, in what is called the archaic style, so can be dated to around 1st century CE, early 1st century CE, late 2nd century BCE, early 1st century BCE. What you would notice here is that there is a very tall shaft, and after the shaft there is a realistic nut on top of the phallic emblem, the linga. This is important because it shows that the linga pole, let me call this the linga pole. The linga pole itself was an independent object of worship, where you have poles like this from about 5 feet tall to about 7 feet tall, being established. Many of these are with faces, but not all. It's not a universal phenomenon. Why the face? Because if we were to look at the descriptions, we do not have a description of the linga with a face in textual sources. If we were to believe the textual sources, why not? Now, nor are there any pre-existent lingas. But when these kind of lingas start being made during the 1st century BCE onwards, there is a face. Now, why the face is the question I've just asked you. And that is, I think that there is a need to create a synergy between the newly and already established worship of the linga with Shivaism in a more anthropomorphic form. As you have the emergence of anthropomorphic images, that is, images of men and women, whether it be yakshas or nagas, there is a competitive theism, one can call it, but a desire to identify these particular pieces as belonging to a particular sect. Shivaism is an emerging sect of a great god. And this is, I think, the reason why you have the affixation of the face. Of course, it also involves major theological concepts which are related to Shiva and the nature of Shiva. So we will be looking at the nature of Shiva shortly and how they are embedded in the worship of the linga per se, which is the major way that one that where it is put, how it is put, and how is it worshipped are all built into the linga itself. Okay. We have a similar one from, but one thing that I would like you to notice is that it is a turbaned figure. Okay. Now this turbaned figure is very much in keeping with the early historic art that we are finding from Mathura. And this gives us not just a stylistic basis of dating it, but it's also meaningful. Better? Is it better now? Better? Okay. Right. So, there is a crest imposed upon the knot of the turban, and very importantly, there is no third eye. Now, in the early lingas, there are no third eyes as a rule. They may be there or may not be there. It is only when we come to the late Kushana, early Gupta period that the third eye becomes an important element, because theologically that is being incorporated into the legends, myths, and worship of and the nature of Shiva as he gets worshipped by the Pashupatas and the Atimarga. Now, these are all carved in the round and are meant for independent worship. And the audience, as well as the purpose of linga worship, can be gleaned from the steles from Mathura and terracottas from Agroha, etc. There are in situ lingas which have been also reported from by Gupta and others, which are similar. Now I talk about an unpublished linga. This is from Khokra Court, which is now in the Jhajjar Museum, but you would see that it has a horizontal eye. The vertical eye is something that you would see much later. The horizontal eye is what you would see. This is a much abraded piece, but mustaches is again something which is featured in Kushana, that is 1st and 2nd century, up to 3rd century CE pieces from Mathura and related sites. Now, what this is from Maholi, it's just, if recall, it's on the outside gallery. Now, here, everything else looks the same, except that there is a garland which is reminiscent of the kind of iconographic or iconographies of stupas, of stambhas that we find at Bharut and Sanchi. So obviously there is a relationship between the worship of a stupa and a linga and a stambha, and they are almost coeval in terms of their worship practices. This is a very interesting one. There is, of course, the one from Mathura Museum, which has a garland and a crest, but the other one, the Rehe Linga, which is now, you can't read the inscription, but the report by G.R. Sharma and D.P. Sharma, who discovered this particular image or pole. It's a very tall pole, it's 2.7 meters almost in height, and it has an inscription which talks about Menander according to the excavators. This is a much debated element, but I would like to come to three important steles that I will be discussing in detail to look at the worship of the linga. These are almost contemporaneous to the production of the independent lingas that we have just seen, whether it is from Arghapur or from Ray or from Maholi, etc. But what you see here is that there is a dwarf who is heading away from this linga. The linga has a mukhalinga, is a mukhalinga, and you will see here. Here, you can see that there is a shaft and there is a face. This is a tree. This is a face to the top knot. And here you have the dwarf who is walking away with offering. There is this kind of a Vedika around this, right? So what we do have, and there's another small person here, right? So what we have is that you have the worship, the actual physical worship in a arboreal setting under a tree, a linga established in a shrine being shown. And I think that's a very important point of how the early lingas were actually being worshipped. They're not established in their temples. They are established in open air shrines, just like others. Now, similar thing that we have here, this is more like the Maholi and linga because it doesn't have a face, but it is clearly a linga that has again a railing and a tree over it. Here, on both sides, you will see winged beings or vyalas who are worshipping the linga. So, whether they are dwarf yakshas or they are Vidyadhar kind of people, or the next one, which is I think one more interesting and the most interesting one for me is this one, in which you have the worship of a linga. We can't say whether it's iconography because part of it is broken, but doesn't look like it, and it is being worshipped by celestials as well as there's two people who are wearing a Scythian dress. Now, the Scythian kind of a dress is also seen in the dancers on stupas such as Sanchi and other spaces. This is basically to show that all kinds of multi-religious, multi-ethnic populations were worshipping and were part of the expanding theistic cult of the great god. What is also very interesting is the introduction of a pedestal instead of railing. You have a pedestal. Now, this is something that continues in the depictions even in the Gupta period. If you were to walk inside this gallery, you will come across this worship of the linga in one of the Gupta fragments here. In order to give it context, I would like to introduce these narrative scenes from Bharut and Sanchi, where you can see that the worship of the Bodhi tree is happening with garlands, with pedestals, with offerings, very much like the ones that you see on the linga steles that I have just illustrated. Similarly, you have these kind of attendants. The railing and attendants are very similar to the kind that we see for the linga steles, and I think this is also because we are talking about a common cultural matrix from where iconographic traits are being taken. We've already done this. Now, what I would also like to now go on to are some Panchamukhlingas, which are very early. This is inscribed Panchamukhlinga from Bhita. Now, why is this so important? Paleographically, of course, it's important because it's giving us an early date of about the 1st century BCE. But even more important is that it mentions that it is a linga. There is a actual epigraphic evidence that this is called a linga, and it helps us in correlating it with things like Kaushika Brahman or other Brahmanas where you have the mention of the linga worship. The fact also is that there is a development of theology where the Panchabhutas are now being linked to the worship of Shiva. This is extremely, I think, significant development iconographically because it predates the actual textualization of the Panchabhuta attributes of the Chaturmukha Panchamukha Linga. But iconographically, we have its representation coming in much before that. There are 5 faces. The top one, Ishan, is very rarely, if ever, shown. Usually only 4 faces are shown, and the 5th face, because it represents ether or space, is rarely depicted. Right. I think I have 10 or 12 more minutes, so I will illustrate some of these. The other one, this is from 2nd century CE. Again, you have that garland and you have the 4 faces. Here, you will see that you have the Rama face and the Tatpurush face and Sadhguru face very clearly demarcated. The turban that we saw in the Arghapur and the Philadelphia examples is again repeated in the main face, which is Tatpurush. What even more important and more interesting for me is the Chaturmukha from the Sapsamudri Koop or well, which is dated to the 3rd century CE, because here you have not one pole, not one linga with 4 faces, but what you have are different 4 lingas that are adorsed together, like you would have in adorsed lions of Ashokam and later pillars. So this particular development or experimentation is important because it never took on. It's a very odd example of something that was tried and somehow it did not work, or people were not able to identify with this particular kind of representation. But I will show you one example that perhaps it wasn't as irrelevant as we think it was. It really, at some point, did make a difference and make a mark. These are some of the other faces of the same. This is a 4-faced or a Chaturmukha linga from Mathura, very difficult to date, but probably was enshrined. Now there is a picture that I do not have, but from the late Kushan, early Gupta period from Varanasi, Kissing has published a picture of a small shrine with a linga enshrined in it, a Ekmukha linga with a small hole, not as tall as the ones that we are talking about, which were independent worship objects, but these kind of holes. But experimentation is something that happens constantly in the early period of linga worship at Mathura. And from Adringa, we have a Dvimukha linga. Now, I at least have not come across any more examples of this. This is a very interesting piece. It's a very well made, fine piece of art, but it of course shows that it is a late Kushana period thing, but it still has mustaches and a horizontal. It only has a mama face on top. Then you have from Bhita other examples. Now, why is this important is that the size of the shaft compared to the ling of the face is coming down in terms of proportion compared to what we have in the poles. So it's no longer a pole; it is more of a ling as we understand it. Compared to this, now this is an early example. This is what I think Professor Mani was talking about when he introduced this, that how do we see the development into the classic lingas. So from here, where the shaft is bigger, to where the shaft is smaller, to a shaft where the face and the shaft are almost of the same size, to the classic Gupta pieces. Now where you have now don't think that this is a pole. This is not a pole. This is where theological developments have created and theistic developments have created straight away you have Vishnu, Brahma and Shiva. You have the Brahma Bhag, the Vishnu Bhag, and you have the Shiva Bhag. More Ekamukha lingas from Mathura. Okay. Oh, thank you. Some of the examples from Kaushambi, though I am not convinced of their identification, but these have been identified in the Jhajjar Museum. And now I come to the Parthiv lingas or the clay lingas. These are the understudied ones. Nobody studied these at all. But we see that there is the fact that clay lingas were being made is important, because in textual tradition, Parthiv lingas are to be worshipped, especially by women. It says very clearly that it is gendered also. But and also if you don't have a stone linga, please make and worship a clay linga. So you have this. This I found from Bhita. Again, it's a very early piece, and this very fine piece, which is a late piece from Bihar. It doesn't give the provenance. I would ask Professor Mani to help me there, because I'm sure he knows. These are some of the faces. These are not lingas. These are Shiva faces from Reichsburg Museum in Zurich, which I found, which can be dated. Now I come to the last part of my presentation, which is how are these worshipped. Obviously, you see here that there is a ritual linga plate which was excavated or found from Agroha, is now in the Jhajjar Museum. And you have the Sapta Samudri kind of a pole-like congregation of lingas here. You have Ganesh, which is very early, Yoni Pita, in which you have a linga, which is, just to give you a better idea, from the other side, which has been established. Also, from Agroha, we found this particular plate. Now, these are very small compared to the very tall and very big and monumental lingas that we started with. Does this suggest a transition from the monumental freestanding lingas to domestic worship is a question that we can ask. You also have these examples, which I do not have the time to go into, or to show you the transition from the to establishment of lingas in their own shrines. So you have the establishment of lingas in cave architecture at Udaipur, where you have lingas being enshrined and worshipped, to structural temples such as this one at Dhumara, where the linga is not only worshipped, but you also have a bust of Shiva on the Lalata Bimb, or on the entrance, as an emblem of what lies within. So this is the Lalat, and this is the Ekamukha linga that we are talking about. You can again see this as an enshrined object, very beautifully and very elaborately carved. You have all the theological elements associated with Shiva here, including the vertical third eye. You have the Raj Rishi thing with two necklaces, one of Rudraksha. Chandrachud with jatas flowing down his head, the diadem, so on and so forth. So from the very early turbaned head that you find Alkapur and the Philadelphia examples, you have it developing into jatas, which become a jata mukutu in the Gupta period. This is again how it was enshrined, probably enshrined at in one of the temples, which is at Nachna Kuchara, which is known as the Parvati temple. These are other images of Shiva that were also made, which are not lingas, but are nevertheless important for the development of Shaiva iconography, such as this Ardhanarishwar with Parvati and from this site. And this is, of course, some of the details that you can see of the lingas as they developed from the early period to the late Kushan Gupta period. I will stop here so that if anybody has any questions or comments, because I have till 4 o'clock, I believe, they may please ask.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this enlightening lecture and taking us through such brilliant visuals put together like an exhibition. It was almost like walking through some virtual exhibition here. Can we have another round of applause, please? And be prepared with your questions. We have time for 4 questions. Anyone from the audience would like to ask anything? ये हैंड माइक चालू कर दीजिए प्लीज. डन.
नमस्ते मैम, मैं आपका स्टूडेंट हूँ. मैम अभी जो लिंग है, तो अभी का जो रूप है, जो जैसे मेल और फीमेल का जो अभी योनि है और जो लिंग है, उससे कोई रिलेशन है क्या?
आप कौन सी की बात कर रहे हैं? शुरुआत के या लास्ट में जो बात कर रहे हैं हम, वो ऑब्वियसली वो योनि लिंग में ही योनि पीठ पर स्थापित है मोस्टली. तो एक्सेप्ट जो टूटे हुए हैं उनका हमें नहीं पता है. जो हमें एक्सटेंट मिले हैं वो स्थापित है, लेकिन ये अर्ली पीरियड में नहीं दिखाई देता है. अर्ली पीरियड में हमें इसका इतना कोई हमें एविडेंस नहीं मिल रहा है. जिन पोल्स की बात कर रही हूँ मैं, उसमें बाद में जैसे कि अग्रोहा के हमें टेराकोटा के एग्जाम्पल्स मिले हैं, उसमें डेफिनेटली हमें योनिपीठ का एग्जाम्पल मिला है. तो ऑब्वियसली जिस समन्वय का हमें दिखाई दे रहा है अर्धनारीश्वर में, वही टेंडेंसी, वही जो वो ही रिलीजियस और रिचुअल डेवलपमेंट हमें आगे दिखाई दे रही है इन यूनिपीठ में, यूनिपीठ के साथ हम।
लेकिन वो बनाया क्यों गया था? कोई कुछ ऐसा लगता
अच्छा,
है?
हाँ, आपको ये तो पता ही है कि पुरुष और प्रकृति का भारत में हमेशा से ही एक प्रचलन रहा है, और मतलब इट इज़ वन ऑफ द मोस्ट इम्पोर्टेंट organizing principles of Indian religious thought, that there is a unity of binaries. Now, the most important binary is that of Purush and Prakriti. How does one actually show this union? One I've already talked about in class of Mithunas. But beyond the Mithunas, at a more metaphysical level, there is the idea that without this union, nothing is complete. Creation cannot happen, and you need one as the activating power of the other. So, this particular thing is, in fact, in the Shiv Puran, it says that this is a perpetual union. Okay? कि ये हमेशा से है और हमेशा रहेगा, और इसको रहना पड़ेगा, नहीं तो सृष्टि नहीं चलेगी. It's a very important theological aspect.
Good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, I am Priyank from Archaeological Survey of India headquarters. Ma'am, I have two questions. The one is, ma'am, we start getting identification of Shivlinga from Harappa excavation by M.S. Vatsji in 1924, where he has identified two Shivlinga in terracotta forms. Later on, we also have displayed in National Museum from Dholavira, where Vishji has identified those tall freestanding columns with phallus. So, ma'am, what are your views, whether there was a freestanding column or it was a linga worship happening at Sindhu Saraswati civilization? Because we are getting it from Kalibanga also in a smaller form, in a terracotta, and in Harappa also we are getting from where M.S. Vatsji has excavated it, and then after from all the way from Harappa and Kalibanga, now we are getting it from Dholavira also, after 50-60 years. The second question is, ma'am, the basis of identifying Gudi Mallam Shivlinga to 2nd century BCE, because it is very much debated, and as we see, the Shivlinga is in a very well defined form. The iconography is also very defined. So, is there any possibility that there might be this concept of Shivlinga worship going on for many centuries in southern India, in Andhra Pradesh particularly, and it manifested in the Gudi Mallam Shivlinga in 2nd century BC, but it was going on for a very long period of time. Thank you, ma'am.
All right. First of all, whether the Harappan period Shivalingas can be identified, phallic objects can be identified as Shivalingas, right? I have no idea, because the script has not been deciphered. And from the 5th century, now even, for example, Shishan Devtas, okay, of the Rigvedic period, they are not saying these are lingas. If they wanted to, they could have, no? So, but they call them Shishan Devtas, which are phallic Devtas. So that I cannot say. Similarly, from the Brahmanas, from Panani onwards, we do know lingas exist for worship, right? So from there onwards, I am pretty confident in stating that linga worship was there. Before that, without evidence which states that this is a linga, and that is why for me Bhita is so important, is that it says that it is a linga, right? Now, epigraphically, if you are getting a label or an identification, that's an important aspect of art history. That there was phallic worship, okay, or phallic objects were being made is obvious from the Harappan, Mohenjo-daro, Kalibanga and Dholavira examples that you've stated. Whether these were identified with Shiva, Proto Shiva, Pashupati, etc., has been a matter of so much debate amongst proto-historical archaeologists that I am not an expert to talk about that. Now, the other one, which is Gudi Mallam, why am I giving that date? I could be wrong by about 100 years. The date that I'm giving is on stylistic basis. And because if you look at the carving on Gudimanam and the kind of turbans, the kind of bas relief that you are seeing, and the kind of objects that you see, and there is very, very similar to the ones that you're getting in Bharut. So now if you give Bharut 2nd century or 1st century BCE date based on iconography and other factors, then that is the kind of date I would like to posit for Gudimanam. Secondly, the kind of railing that you're getting at Gudimanam is again very similar to the kind of railings that you're getting elsewhere in from these kind of strategic or art historical context, and that is the reason why I would like to give it a date. Well, it's maybe we do have evidence of art from Kanagahali, which is coming up. We also have modern layers at and modern and postmodern layers at Amravati, Nagarjun, Goli. So this area is actually giving us very early art historical dates, given that it is very much a possibility that you have Shivalingas or something that evolves into a Shivalinga in this area, because by the time we come to the 5th century, it's absolutely established that you have this kind of worship happening in most of India, and it's also been mentioned.
हेलो मैम, नमस्कार। मैं अनुराग, हिस्ट्री का स्टूडेंट हूँ। जो इसमें आपने लास्ट में जो देखा योनि पीठ वाला शिवलिंग जो है, क्या ये इन्वेडर्स के आने के बाद कुछ मैनिपुलेशन की वजह से तो नहीं है?
देखिए, मेरे हिसाब से अग्रोहा जो है, और अभी अग्रोहा की एक्सकवेशन फिर शुरू हुई है, बहुत खुशी की बात है। आई एम सो हैप्पी। अग्रोहा अभी तक जो हमें डेट्स मिली है अग्रोहा की, वो हमें पोस्ट मॉडर्न डेट्स मिली है मेनली। तो ये पोस्ट मॉडर्न डेट्स तो आपको पता ही है कि अर्ली डेट्स है। तो मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि ये कहीं पर अर्ली डेट से ही निकला हुआ ये एविडेंस है। तो उसमें मुझे कोई लेट डेट का संभावना नहीं दिखाई दे रही, ना ही उसके आइकॉनोग्राफिक फॉर्म्स में दिखाई दे रही, क्योंकि सप्तसमुद्री से हमें मिला है वैसा एक शिवलिंग जो कि अर्ली डेट है।
Hello, ma'am. Traveler. Is phallic worship, as you said, dated from earlier centuries, then transforming into something else? Do we have phallic worship evidence in other lands beyond the boundaries, say western, beyond the western Hindu?
Absolutely, you get phallic worship everywhere, or in many, you know that, and phallic, it may not be worship. When you have phallic objects.
Phallic objects, yeah.
Yeah, so they may not be objects of worship.
Correct.
So Rome, we know, for example, that these are not objects of worship, but they're phallic objects, which are being used for various things, including festivals, which are Baudi and related to Dionysical or Dionysic Bacchanalian rites. So you have objects, you have in Mesopotamia also. So the fact is that they have been worship. Down from there, I think it's a question of independent origination. That you can't, just because you get a similar kind of object from two places doesn't mean that they have to be in contact with each other. Unless and until they're very, very similar transcultural objects. No, I don't think so. I think that this is a very organic movement.
So we'll close now. Thank you everyone for asking such lovely questions. It shows you were so engaged throughout the presentation. I was doing this on behalf of my colleague Rige, who is busy elsewhere, so couldn't be here. So a round of applause for organizing that she did all of this at the background. And I invite all of you for a cup of tea, and we can discuss a few things with ma'am over there.